This is Enacting the Kingdom, a podcast about liturgical worship. I'm Fr Yuri, an Orthodox Christian priest with a lifelong desire to keep learning. I'm joined by my friend and teacher, Father Geoffrey Reddy. Father Geoffrey is the director of the Orthodox School of Theology at the University of Toronto and holds a doctorate in liturgical theology. And here we are, the first official episode of the third season. We had our intro episode, but this is, the first actual episode where we're diving into something specific, Father Geoffrey.
Getting into the meat of it, yeah.
Indeed, and we're talking specifically about the prayers for the mother and child. So one thing that a lot of people might not be familiar with is that there are a series of prayers that are done, when a mother who's, like, let's say an Orthodox Christian family the mother has given birth. There's prayers on the first day after the woman has given birth to the child. There's prayers at the time of the naming of the child on the 8th day. There are prayers for the woman on the 40th day of childbirth, right? And then there's various traditions about, should the mother should maybe stay away from church for 40 days just as a time of recovery. Or there's a lot of, preparation for welcoming back mother and child to the church. Before we get to any of those specifics, though, Father Geoffrey, I think it'd be worth maybe diving a little bit deeper into that topic of infant baptism. So infant baptism being something that the Orthodox Church does for families that are practicing Orthodox Christianity. So a lot of these prayers, like the, prayer first day after the woman has given birth, they're for the child and the mother, and they're almost seen as a prelude to the full welcoming of the child into the church through the sacrament of baptism. So let's maybe start there. We baptize babies, but that seems to be what we do, isn't it, Father Geoffrey?
Well, yeah, in the introductory episode, we alluded to this briefly. And I think it's not a question that's really put in quite those terms. I mean, I know it becomes a matter of great controversy in the West, particularly around the time, or really in that sort of second wave of the Protestant Reformation, what's so-called the Anabaptist Reformation, right? Where because the first wave of Protestants did not question the ancient church practice of receiving infants, but there was a kind of second wave, which gives rise to the various traditions, whether they're called Baptists or whether they're called Mennonites, or and so forth. The Anabaptists are those who, and the word Anabaptist just means to baptize again, right? And so they were, committed to this idea of believer baptism, or of people who were kind of able rationally to confess a faith, and then baptism was only meaningful after that. So you'd have to be at least teenage or late teens, an adult, to be received. So that's really where that controversy comes from. And the way the question gets posed there then gets imported, to the East. But I just think from the get-go, we don't really have the same question in the forefront of our minds, right? It's almost not a question. From the book of Acts onwards, we hear about people who are convicted in their hearts by the preaching of the apostles. They receive the Christian message. They confess Jesus as Lord. They want to go through that process of being brought into God's covenant family. And as a matter of course, with them come their households, their families, right? And I mean, because of the thinking about the way the church is constructed as the extension of God's covenant relationship with Israel, his covenant family, that we are all sons and daughters, we are all reborn into new creation. All of that way of thinking about the church, it quite naturally extends to all, right? And it's almost like it happens without even really posing a question. Oh, where are the limits of who should be received through this process? Are there criteria? Well, no, the criterion is simply this response of faith and love to God's invitation, right? So the apostles preach, people respond, and then with them, they bring everyone and everything in their household, in their family, and so forth. And so at no point do you actually find in the early church a discussion of this question. It's done as a matter of course. And I think it is to do with the way that the church is thought of, kind of as a family. And I think if the question were to be posed, if you were to take that 17th century question and go back, people would be very bemused, by it. And they would wonder, about how you've constructed it, about, what do you mean you have to have some kind of rational, ability to understand? Sure, none of us understand. All we know is God loves us and we are responding, out of love and faith, and it's all grace, isn't it? So, I just think, there's a wrongness about even posing the question, do Orthodox, accept infant baptism? Well, it's very hard to ask the question in a way that you can get a meaningful answer. Now, the fact that the practice continued over many centuries, and we said this in the introductory episode as well, that, the normal practice is that, it's for people who are a little bit older, including, a lot of adults. Even people who were born into Christian families would be, would wait. But it wasn't on the basis on which the question is set in the 17th century, right? It actually in the early church had far more to do with this idea of, that with baptism we are remade, we are a new creation, and we are essentially made saints, right? And the business from that day forward is to implement what is, right? With our rebirth in baptism, with our personal Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we have all the gifts to be saints. So the job then is to implement that, to draw down on that, not to kind of earn our way to that, right? It's not the beginning of a process. It is the eschatological moment of entering the kingdom. And so some, in fact, a great deal of people would have thought, well, actually, what is the way back if you do that and then you kind of mess up, right? And so until the sacrament of confession emerges and has a whole complicated history, we could maybe do a whole podcast or series on that at some point, Father Yuri, but until that happens, there's a real reluctance. And the debate in the early church is not about whether infants should be received, but whether is it possible that having been baptized, that you can fall away and then come back, right? And there's a good deal of debate over that. Some of the early, authorities and church fathers will say quite clearly, no, it's a once for all deal. So you better be very careful. Now, they're not thinking about, ordinary day-to-day sin, but about big things, right? About what happens if you go and offer incense to the emperor, or you adjure Christ, or you do something serious like murder, adultery, or what have you. Is there a way back? And for centuries there isn't, right? Until finally, the penitence and confession come along, but that's where the debate is. Can you be baptized, fall away, and then come back? Is there a second chance? Well, eventually confession becomes that second chance. It's actually even referred to as a second baptism, not quite an Anabaptism, but a second, a rediscovery of the grace of that first baptism. But that's the debate of the early church, not whether, there's some sort of level of achievement you need to get to before you can be baptized. So the thought is that an infant, somebody with mental challenges, somebody with a lack of speech, somebody with, there's no limit to where God's grace can go with this. The response is one of faith in the heart. It's a mystery. None of us understand any of it anyway. So how can you kind of set a criterion of you need to achieve this or do this in order to earn your way? So in a kind of funny way, that second wave of Protestant Reformation in the Anabaptist one introduces a kind of works righteousness. You have to be able to do this work of confession rationally, of faith, before you can earn your way to baptism. We're much more focused on God's grace and the idea that all are welcome within that. So if you belong to a family that's being received in the church, you're going to be just swept up in that tide of grace that will bring you forward. And I say it never even comes up as a question. It really doesn't until 1700 years later, when this happens in the West, and then Orthodox are scratching their heads saying, well, what do we even think about this? And by then, the 1700 years of, infants received, but I say in the Middle Byzantine period, about a very different kind of thinking about it. early childhood, but with that capacity for memory. And I think, that's an interesting thing that we can think about as we go through the whole service of baptism, and think about why we might want people to actually remember this sacramentally, this experience of it. But it's a very different question from having earned it. This is more about how it can possibly continue to benefit you, particularly in light of you need to stick to your baptism. You need to live it out. You need to implement it, and not just accept the fact that this is your ticket to salvation or something.
I'll share a story with you about my best friend. So he comes from an Anabaptist tradition, and we were one day talking about baptism, and we're talking specifically about the well, in the Anabaptist tradition, it's sort of a believer's baptism where you have to be able to profess your faith in front of the community, right? You have to sort of give your testimony, so to speak, and then you can get baptized, right? And I know of people who don't get baptized because they just don't want to do any public speaking. But we were talking about baptism, and I was trying to explain that Orthodox idea of, yes, we can indeed, and we do baptize infants, but trying to kind of properly explain it. And I wasn't doing a very good job. And then he says to me, he's like, Yuri, in the Orthodox Church, salvation means belonging to a community. And you know what? Babies can belong to communities. So there you go. I was like, oh,
Well,
yeah, that's kind of a great way to explain it. I don't know. Do you want to react to that, Father Geoffrey?
No, but that's kind of what I'm suggesting from the early church, why it wasn't even a question, right? Because, would you even say that? I mean, if I take this out of the kind of church context or whatever, I mean, would you say about any given family that, oh, well, here's the mother, the father, the older children, everything, they clearly all belong to this family, but here's the newborn infant, not yet a member of the family, right? We'll have to wait and see, when that child can articulate some sort of, rational commitment to being part of that family. Then we'll know, whether they properly are part of that family or not. I mean, that's a completely irrational proposition. And I don't think that's ever even crossed anybody's mind. Well, if the church is a family, it's the family of God, why would you introduce this level of kind of achievement or accomplishment or works into it? I mean, we don't have to earn our way into our families. It's just, de facto, where we are. And so on that level, we just don't even think of that. Now, the interesting question, and that goes to the topic of this particular episode, when you do wait, right, for that, the full sacramental initiation in the mysteries of initiation into that family, right, of baptism, chrismation, and receiving divine communion. So if you do wait, whether it's, as a lot of people did in the early church, to adulthood, or whether you do it to teenage years, or just simply to that, kind of threshold of memory, which is, I think, what the Middle Byzantine period was all about, waiting to about age 3, 4, 5. What do you then do to kind of prayerfully bless, those early members of that community before they can be full sacramental participants? And that's where these prayers emerge. Really, we don't have a tradition of them, in terms of a written form or extant, forms of them until about the 8th century. And they're all about, none of them, the prayers at that point are for the mother. Those come much later, about the 12th or 13th century. But by the 8th century, we have prayers that are about saying something about acknowledging the belongingness of that child, that baby within the community, but more or less kind of making them catechumens, making them those preparing for full participation, which is expected, anticipated, and hoped for. And so, given the fact that, for example, between birth and the age of 3, 4, 5, if they're being baptized at that point, they are going to be present. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that still at that time, catechumens are excluded from the second part of the Divine Liturgy. They're welcome, the first part, the Liturgy of the Word, the so-called Liturgy of the Catechumens, right, where they can hear the scriptures, hear the preaching, hear the prayers of the faithful, but then they are dismissed. But what do you do with a 2-year-old or a 12-month-old, a 12-month-old baby who is present because the mother is breastfeeding, or they just have no other, care available to them? So these prayers emerge essentially to safeguard the attendance, the participation within that community, during the Liturgy of the Faithful, the Liturgy of the Eucharist, the second part of the liturgy, where by that point, all those who were not capacitated really to receive the Eucharist had been dismissed. So you have this unique situation. Some essentially catechumens are still there. So what do you do with them? So that's where this tradition of praying, the kind of churching, this welcome into the family of God, and a kind of pre-anticipation of baptism and so forth. But you're still waiting, which now may still follow very quickly. You mentioned in our intro episode about the Ukrainian Orthodox practice that the children are baptized on the 40th day. Well, then the churching of the child is happening at the same time or right before the baptism, essentially. Maybe part of the churching before and then part right after, right? And I think, a lot of the service books kind of reflect that practice. But Middle Byzantine period, we're talking 10th century, something like that, it would be traditional that the child is there from the 40th day, with his or her mother, but maybe baptized at age 4, let's say. So for that period, you need a kind of extra prayer, extra blessing, and that's where these prayers emerge. And we've got this idea of even before they're made kind of formally catechumens, and we'll be talking in a separate episode about the catechumenate, but we have these blessings of the infant. So the very first ones we have from the 8th century or so are about the baby, this newborn, this infant, about sort of making them part of the community in anticipation of a full sacramental participation, which may have been a few years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just to clarify, there's the actual sacramental service of baptism that exists, but then there's these pre-prayers for certain classes of people, right? One of them being catechumens, and we're going to talk about that next episode. That's one category of people, the people who are being instructed in the faith that will eventually get baptized. But then you also have this other class of people, and it is babies who are part of practicing Orthodox families, right? So, they're not part of the catechumenate in that they're not being instructed in a formal education sense because they're literally babies, but they are being instructed, I guess, within that family unit. And then we have these prayers for mother and child, which are not actually part of the baptism ceremony. These are kind of separate prayers of preparation to prepare the mother and the child to be received back into the church and then eventually towards baptism. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. Now, in a rational implementation of all of this, that's precisely how it would look, right? We have, and we'll talk about in the next episode about the making of a catechumen, which involves, exorcism and all kinds of things. That really is predicated on a kind of adult convert, to the church, right? And it's connected with Lent and so forth. And we'll get into all of that. But towards the end of that, there's this kind of, and call this person, in due time to baptism, right? Well, that same language occurs in these prayers on the 40th day for the child, and as they emerge in the 8th century, and we have the same idea. Bless this child together with his or her parents and his or her sponsors. Count him or her worthy in due season of the new birth through water and the Spirit. Number him or her with your holy flock of rational sheep who are called by the name of your Christ. So already part of the rational flock, but being called in due time to baptism, to chrismation. And so essentially what these prayers for the child on the 40th day are, that's the making of a catechumen, right? You don't need then to apply the service of the making of a catechumen to people in that category, those who are in a Christian household, who are already, because they're part of that community, considered, to be, participants in that wider family. They have to yet go through the fullness of baptism, but they are already kind of grafted into the community in that way. So these are the prayers of making a catechumen for people in that situation. You wouldn't therefore repeat them in a rational implementation of all of this. Now, what happens usually is that both these prayers are prayed and, right at the moment of baptism, the full, prayers of exorcism and making a catechumen. So we kind of double up a little bit, on this. But here's, where the two things come from two different places, but they're both directed towards the same end, purpose and telos here, of bringing people into the fullness of the kingdom through new birth in water and spirit.
Some parents might note that it is prayers for the mother and child, right? The father is not super central in these prayers. And my understanding, Father Geoffrey, maybe we could talk a bit more about this, is that, these preliminary prayers that are meant to sort of contextualize, I guess, the act of bringing a life into the world, right, within the context of the church and what that means, and then also laying the groundwork for the re-entry into the community. One of the ways that I understand this is, that there is a tradition of basically not putting the Sunday obligation upon a woman who has just given birth, right? This idea that, like, well, we have to get to church to receive communion, but you've just given birth, so stay home, right? Like, recover, take your time, right? Your body needs to recover. And that these prayers are sort of built into that tradition of recovery, I guess. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that's a recasting of the tradition. I mean, the reality is these prayers don't emerge, the prayers for the mother on the 40th day, until about the 12th or 13th century. And, we can be pretty sure about that because we have, we can't be so sure about things before the 8th century. So when we see things emerge in the 8th century, like these prayers for the child, we don't know how far they go back because we just don't have manuscripts before then. But we have a lot of manuscripts from the 8th through the 12th and 13th century. So by the time something emerges in the 12th or 13th century, we can be pretty sure it's a relatively new thing because it's not in the earlier manuscripts, if that makes sense. So, and this is right before printing press comes along and where these things get codified in a way that now Orthodox think of as kind of immutable, unchangeable. This is for all time because it's in print. It's in a book, with a cover, and, my goodness, it's always been that way. Wasn't this what the apostles were doing? Becomes, the way of thinking. But until then, liturgy's a lot in flux. But by the 12th or 13th century, for whatever reason, and it can be traced to lots of different things, but there's a kind of repackaging of the old covenant notions about ritual purity. Now, I'm going to be very clear here. The gospel itself deals with what ritual purity is all about. And Jesus refocuses our attention from bodily impurities, which exists clearly in the Torah, in the Jewish law, the old covenant practices, and so forth. There were certain things that happened that made you ritually impure. And what impurity meant was you were not capacitated precisely to be at worship in the temple, to offer sacrifice, to be in a kind of full liturgical participant in the covenant. You had to be excluded and then readmitted, and you had to go through forms of purification, things like mikveh, the ritual bath, and so forth, which was the kind of precursor to baptism, which is interesting, right? So, for example, on a monthly basis, women were deemed ritually impure because of their, monthly period and so forth. And men, with emissions, nocturnally or otherwise, were deemed ritually impure, had to be readmitted through a process of purification. So all of this exists in the Old Covenant. Jesus, in the Gospels, relocates impurity to a matter of the heart, right? He says it's not outside things, whether it's washing your hands or all of these issues of impurity, but what comes out of the heart that makes you impure. So things like judgment and cursing and envy and malice and so forth. These are the things that make us impure. So up until, from the gospel forward, until about the 12th or 13th century, that ritual purity idea is largely absent, right, from the Orthodox tradition. But suddenly, it gets re-imported around this consideration of childbirth. So under Jewish tradition, and we know our Lord's mother herself did this on the 40th day, went to be purified. The purification on the 40th day of the mother after childbirth was all part of that Jewish law. That was done away with. Jesus, yes, was brought as an infant, the whole story of the meeting of the Lord in the temple and everything, but that was predicated on an Old Testament ideas about impurity. That was replaced. But by the 12th or 13th century, it's coming back in. So now no longer do you have just prayers for the child to make the child a catechumen, essentially, within this Christian household. You now have prayers to get rid of the defilement, the uncleanness, the ritual impurity of the mother, right? That having gone through the process of childbirth, which involves, a lot of blood, a lot of, emission of bodily fluids and so forth. It's a messy business. But, Christianity had until that point really gotten away from the idea that made one impure. It was just part of life, but, what makes us impure is it's what comes out of our hearts. But now suddenly we re-import these categories in relation to childbirth, and the woman is deemed impure. So you mentioned the father's not mentioned. Well, he didn't get messy through this process, right? I mean, his business was done 9 months before. So at this point, the woman is excluded from the liturgical community for those 40 days, and then has to re-enter by some undoing of the uncleanness, of the ritual impurity and so forth. So that's the kind of textual liturgical reality that's being reflected. As I say, it's contrary to the gospel. It undermines, it inverts the gospel in a big way. Now, the cast that you gave to it, I think, is a much gentler and friendlier and maybe more in keeping with the gospel way of approaching it. I've presented this, myself to people, because in fact there are canons that say you are to be at every Eucharistic assembly, right? So every, the canons say that if you miss 3 Sundays in a row and you're in town and have no good reason to have been missing, then you are actually excommunicated and you need to come back through confession. Well, what this grace period of 40 days says, particularly, until very recently, childbirth was a life and death matter, right? A lot of women died in childbirth because of germs and bacteria that we didn't know about. And so people weren't necessarily sterilizing the equipment and hands and everything being used in this. And women died of infections in tremendous numbers. Just go to visit a 19th century graveyard and you will see how many young women are dying about a day after their child also died or whatever. Makes for very sad reading. Well, in that sort of situation, you want to make every precaution so that the woman is given a chance to recover full health and so forth. So I like the idea of saying you're excluded from the necessity of being in church. You got like 6 weeks essentially, and when you do come, we'll welcome you back. But that's not what the prayers are saying. I think we could retain something of this, with all of the tradition of that and the connection with our Lord and his mother. I think people want to do that too, but really take it out of that idea that the woman has actually somehow sinned or transgressed by, the messiness of childbirth. Because what an extra burden that is to weigh upon people who are going through this tremendous mystery of giving birth, bringing new life into the world. To put guilt onto that, and shame and impurity seems to me highly unchristian and contrary, to the gospel. But we can sort of say, actually, take the 6 weeks, form that bond with your child. And it's not even just because today the issues of maybe the cleanliness of that and the germs and everything, we've largely got rid of that. And thankfully, a lot of women, most women survive childbirth in a way that they hadn't before. But we still have this idea of the latching on of the child and, intimate breastfeeding and frequent breastfeeding and care and everything. And to give that 6 weeks, I think, is a highly pastoral thing to do. So let's do that. But let's make the prayers reflect then that, right? And pray for the whole family, father and mother. Pray for that attachment, for that bond, for that care. Pray for the great mystery that they participated in. All of that is actually absent, from these prayers. And I think there's been a lot of discussion more recently. The Ecumenical Patriarchate has taken a great lead in this. In fact, has said, don't use the prayers as they exist from the 13th century. These are not appropriate. They don't reflect the gospel. And some efforts are being made to kind of introduce something new. So let's not throw proverbially the baby out with the bathwater. Let's retain all of the the goodness of the interpretation you gave to it there about the kind of extra care and concern that we have for the family, and then just make it a celebration of the life that has been brought into the world. Again, welcoming the child as a catechumen, but welcoming the bonding of that family together and all of the wonderful, natural, beautiful things that are happening, through that. I mean, it's okay to have a little bit of that tinge of sinfulness about it, because everything that we do is tinged with sinfulness. But let's not locate a kind of deep ritual impurity and uncleanness and defilement in the actions that have taken place. I think that's just, we still know about things like postpartum depression that women can be susceptible to because of hormonal changes and everything. I mean, why would you go out of your way to provoke something like that by saying, by the way, on top of everything else, you should be guilty and ashamed of what has just happened? And my goodness, it's just not pastorally what we should be doing. So some rethinking should happen around this, particularly given how late and inappropriate these prayers were in their origin.
Well, we've hit our time, Father Geoffrey, but I want to give you the opportunity. Is there anything else you want to bring up specifically about the prayers of the for the mother and child?
We'll maybe touch on this at some other episode in the series, but let me just mention that there's this further dimension to it, because at the time of the prayers for mother and child on the 40th day, there's also the so-called churching, which takes place where the child is, again, imagining a small infant, because you wouldn't imagine anybody larger than that being carried in, but taken up in the arms of the presbyter, and very reminiscent to Simeon receiving our Lord. So this is a beautiful thing. And in fact, entering into the church while the presbyter is reciting the prayer of Saint Simeon. And I refer people back to that episode, the several episodes that we talked about the Song of Simeon in Vespers and how beautiful that is. So all that's really, really lovely. But then there's this further complication of the tradition of taking the child into the altar area, into the sanctuary behind the holy table, and making a circuit as some of those prayers are being prayed. Initially, that was babies who were male and female, but only after the time of baptism, because you couldn't imagine an unbaptized person, even if they had been made a catechumen, being brought in through that circuit. So that was a post-baptismal thing, but that kind of got joined together with these prayers on the 40th day. So then you got unbaptized people, because they were not yet, they'd just been welcomed into the church on the 40th day, doing that. And then, because of kind of more modern, basically sexism and so forth, because a lot of our kind of male dominating female ideas come from the modern period, not from ancient ideas. You got the tradition which exists particularly among Slavs of only boy babies being brought, around the altar. And the service books will even say that from the 16th, 17th century, onwards. If it's a male child, you bring, even unbaptized, into the altar around the holy table. If it's a female child, you deposit her on the steps of the solea, up to the kind of platform in front of the iconostasis. And that there's a lot of problematic about that as well for all kinds of reasons. But essentially, if we do that thing about the carrying into the Holy of Holies, into the altar area, it really ought to be post-baptismal. Although at that point, if you've received divine communion, it seems a little bit superfluous, but still could be a lovely tradition. But it certainly should be male and female, no distinction, made between them. Or you just simply locate the bringing into the church with the prayer of Saint Simeon on the prayers of the 40th day, but you don't enter into the altar, because really nobody who's not baptized should be ever going back there. You go there if you have a good reason, you're baptized, and we all have access to that because of our baptism, not because of, we're male or female or what have you. So I mean, that's a very short description of all that. Maybe it'll come up again as we talk about different parts of the service as we go through this series.
Yeah, thank you very much to our audience. Stay tuned for next week's episode, where we go through what it means to be a catechumen, and what does that look like, and how does that relate to the journey towards baptism. So we'll see you next week.
Bye for now.
Enacting the Kingdom is a patron-supported show, and if you're not a patron, you're only getting half of everything we create. If you'd like to join our growing community of supporters, please go to patreon.com/enactingthekingdom. Your patronage goes a long way to keeping this show going. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.